The stars outside Ambassador Ilara Voss's viewport had never looked so beautiful, and she had never trusted beauty less. She pressed her palm against the cold transparisteel, watching the violet twin suns of Cathara Prime bleed orange at their edges as her shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere. Behind her, her aide, a young man named Tariq, was organizing her diplomatic credentials for the 14th time that hour. "You've checked those enough," she said without turning around. "I know," Tariq replied. "I just like having something to do with my hands." She understood. She felt it too, that low electric hum beneath the skin that no amount of training ever fully killed. The Ketharan had not invited a human ambassador in 11 years. The sudden invitation, arriving 3 weeks ago through back-channel frequencies rather than official conclave infrastructure, had struck her as unusual. Her superiors called it a breakthrough. Ilara Voss called it something else privately in the quiet of her cabin at 300 hours when sleep wouldn't come. She called it a trap, but she went anyway. That was the job. The Ketharan were a tall species, 7 feet of layered exoskeletal plating over dense musculature, with 4 upper limbs and eyes that caught light like mirror shards. They were ancient, proud, and they had made no secret of their contempt for humanity's relative youth in the galactic community. 40 years since first contact, and the Ketharan High Council still referred to humans in official documents as the newcomers, a deliberate diminishment that Earth's diplomatic corps had learned to ignore with practiced grace. The welcoming ceremony at the landing platform was elaborate and cold. High Executor Vroth, the third-ranking member of the Ketharan High Council, received her with the precise, performative warmth of a politician who had rehearsed hospitality without ever feeling it. He was enormous. His ceremonial armor was inlaid with the bones of conquered species, a tradition Ilara had been briefed on and instructed not to acknowledge. She smiled, shook the offered limb, spoke the greeting in formal Cathari which she'd spent 4 months learning. Vroth's mirror-shard eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe, or contempt, wearing surprise as a costume. The talks were scheduled for 3 days. Trade routes, territorial boundaries, a proposed joint mining operation in the Tessaran Belt. Ilara had spent 8 months preparing. She had brought data. She had brought compromise. She had brought a genuine, carefully constructed path toward something that might, in 20 years, become trust. She had 6 hours. The first 4 were procedural pleasantries extended into tedium, the Ketharan practice of exhausting their guests before real negotiation began. Ilara knew the tactic, matched their patience, and waited. Tariq remained aboard the shuttle per protocol. Diplomats met alone. That was the sacred accord. That was the oldest law in the conclave. At hour 5, Vroth excused himself. 3 guards remained. Ilara sat with her hands folded on the obsidian table and felt the hum beneath her skin turn into something colder. At hour 5 and 40 minutes, the guards moved. There was no struggle recorded. The room had no external sensors. The Ketharan had seen to that. What happened in those final 20 minutes, no one outside that room would ever know in detail. What the galaxy saw, what was broadcast, deliberately, across every Ketharan state channel and 17 conclave relay frequencies, was the ending. Tariq was still running diagnostics on the shuttle when the feed appeared on his console. He stared at it for 4 full seconds before his mind accepted what his eyes were showing him. Then he screamed, a raw, animal sound that echoed in the empty cabin, and slammed the emergency beacon. The beacon transmitted for exactly 9 seconds before the Ketharan jamming grid crushed the signal. 9 seconds was enough. The feed reached Earth 17 minutes later, delayed by the speed of light and relay bounce. It arrived at 8:47 hours Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday morning in March, and it interrupted weather reports and school traffic alerts and a cooking program about regional pasta dishes. It played on every screen simultaneously, automatically flagged, automatically elevated, automatically broadcast. The algorithm had never been designed for something like this. It simply saw an emergency diplomatic signal and shared it with the world. Humanity watched. In a primary school in Nairobi, a teacher quickly turned off the classroom screen and pulled 26 children into a story corner, her hands shaking. In a subway car in Seoul, 40 commuters sat perfectly still, staring at their phones, not one of them making a sound. In a bar in Buenos Aires, a man who had served 2 tours with the Colonial Defense Force watched the broadcast, set down his glass very carefully, and walked outside into the early morning air, where he stood alone for a long time. Ilara Voss had walked into that room carrying 8 months of work, a genuine smile, and the absolute legal protection of 3,000 years of interstellar law. The Catharan High Council had decided in their ancient pride and their bottomless contempt for the newcomers that the law did not apply to them, that humanity would mourn quietly, protest formally, and eventually, humbly, return to the table. They had calculated everything. They had only miscalculated one thing, but it was the only thing that mattered. They had never once, in 40 years of watching humanity, studied human history. The Galactic Conclave session that convened 18 hours after the broadcast was, by every historical account, the most chaotic emergency assembly in its 3,000-year existence. Representatives from 46 civilizations spoke simultaneously across 17 translation channels. The luminary high speaker lost his ceremonial composure for the first time in recorded memory. The Vreth delegation physically overturned a data console. 3 species filed immediate motions to sanction the Catharan Empire. 2 others filed counter motions urging investigation before action. The Hall Collective, who communicated through harmonic resonance, produced a frequency so distressed that it shattered 2 observation windows and sent a junior conclave aide to the medical bay. Amid all of this, the human delegation sat quietly at their curved table in Section 7 of the Grand Chamber and said nothing. This was noted. At first it was interpreted as grief, understandable, appropriate, even dignified. The Vothkai Praetor, a 600-year-old statesman named Sewell who had navigated more crises than most civilizations had years, sent a private condolence communique to the human ambassador and received a polite, formal acknowledgement in return. 12 hours later, Earth had still not issued a public statement, no address from the Secretary General, no military communique, no diplomatic protest filed with the conclave registry. Just silence. Praetor Sewell, who had spent decades studying humanity as a personal academic pursuit, a hobby his colleagues found eccentric and mildly absurd, pulled up his research archives at 300 station time and began reading with increasing urgency. He cross-referenced human historical responses to acts of extreme provocation. He read about Pearl Harbor. He read about September 11th. He read about the colonial-era reprisals that had reshaped continents. He read the military doctrine papers that Earth had declassified in the 2180s, which most alien scholars had filed under interesting but primitive. He read the phrase, proportional response is an invitation to repeat the offense, and sat very still for a long moment. Then he pulled the Alien Ambassador Registry, and quietly, without filing any formal notice, began personally contacting every Vothkai citizen residing within 12 light-years of human-controlled space. Meanwhile on Earth, things were happening that had no public face. Manufacturing hubs on 3 continents shifted production schedules without announcement. Civilian shipping lanes near the outer colonies were quietly rerouted by traffic control algorithms that received new priority instructions from servers nobody was publicly discussing. Reserve fleet commanders received encrypted orders through channels that hadn't been active in 11 years. The Colonial Defense Force recalled all leave, system-wide, with a single automated message that contained no explanation. A journalist in New Singapore noticed that the orbital shipyard above the city was running full illumination at 200 hours, all 16 construction bays lit, atmospheric containment fields active, plasma cutters visible from the ground as a constellation of blue-white sparks. She filed a query with the Defense Ministry press office. The press office responded promptly, professionally, and said absolutely nothing informative. She published the image anyway. It was shared 40 million times in 6 hours. Alien ambassadors stationed on Earth began sending home dispatches with a new tone, uncertain, carefully worded, containing phrases like, "The situation is difficult to characterize," and "human behavioral indicators are outside our established models." The Catharan ambassador, sequestered in his compound under quiet but undeniable human security escort, sent 4 increasingly frantic messages to the High Council warning them that something was wrong, that the silence was not grief, that they should consider options. The High Council sent back a single reply: "Let the newcomers mourn. They will return to the table in time. They always do." In the conclave chamber, Peter Sewell finally submitted his resignation from the Vothkai delegation, a galaxy-shaking event in itself, given his tenure. His colleagues were stunned. He told them simply that he was old, that he was tired, and that he intended to spend his remaining years somewhere quiet. He did not tell them which systems he had recommended they evacuate. He did not tell them what he had read at 300 hours. He suspected it would not have mattered. Some lessons, in his long experience, could only be learned by watching. He booked private transport to a station 11 light-years outside human space, settled into his cabin, ordered a warm drink, and began writing what he privately titled his most important academic paper, "On the Nature of Human Patience, and Why It Should Terrify You." He never finished it. Events moved faster than he anticipated. On the 41st hour after the broadcast, Earth's Secretary General stood before a single camera in a bare room with no podium, no flag, no prepared speech visible. She spoke for 90 seconds. She said that Ambassador Alara Voss had served humanity with extraordinary courage and that her sacrifice would not be reduced to a diplomatic incident. She said that humanity had reviewed its options carefully. She said that the response had already begun. She turned off the camera herself. 90 seconds, no threats, no demands, no ultimatum. The Catharan High Council received the translated transcript and found it underwhelming. Vroth reportedly laughed. In orbit above Earth, the first battle group cleared the shipyard moorings in formation and began its transit toward the outer jump corridor. It was the largest simultaneous fleet movement in human history. No ship broadcast its destination. None were required to. Every captain already knew. The UN Security Council session lasted 40 minutes and 11 seconds. This was confirmed later by the official transcript, a document that historians would study for centuries, not for its length, but for what it contained. 40 minutes of the most precise, unsentimental, and coldly purposeful military authorization in recorded human history. There was no debate about whether to respond. There was no faction arguing for restraint, no bloc pushing for sanctions, no procedural delay. Every delegate had watched the same broadcast. Every delegate had sat with it for 40 hours. The agenda had one item. The vote was 15-0. General Commanding Admiral Haruto Mbenga received his orders in a briefing room aboard the fleet carrier ENS Alara Voss. The ship had been renamed by unanimous crew petition within hours of the broadcast, a request the Defense Ministry approved faster than any administrative action in its history. Mbenga was 63 years old. He had silver at his temples and the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades preparing for something he genuinely hoped would never come. He read the orders once, folded the data pad, and handed it back to the courier without a word. "Any questions, Admiral?" the courier asked. "None," Mbenga said. He walked to the bridge, took his chair, and addressed his fleet through the command network in a 2-minute broadcast that was later described by every officer who heard it as the calmest thing they had ever witnessed in uniform. He told them what they were doing. He told them why. He told them that Ambassador Voss had walked into that room unarmed because the law said she would be safe, and that the entire framework of interstellar civilization rested on that promise being unbreakable. He told them that if it could be broken without consequence, it would be broken again, against the next diplomat, the next species, the next civilization too small or too frightened or too isolated to answer. "We are not going to war," he said, and every officer on every ship leaned slightly forward. "We are going to make a correction. The universe made an error when it allowed what happened to Ambassador Voss to go unanswered. We are the answer." He cut the broadcast. The fleet jumped. What the rest of the galaxy did not know, what the Conclave's intelligence apparatus had failed to uncover in 4 decades of monitoring human civilization, was the full scope of what humanity had built in the quiet centuries of expansion. The colonial defense force that alien military analysts had rated as Tier 3, capable but limited, was the public face. The reserve fleets, the black-budget construction programs, the weapons research that Earth had never seen fit to advertise, these were different. These were the product of a species that had survived 2 world wars and a dozen civilizational near-collapses on its own planet before it ever reached the stars, and which had internalized, at a deep cultural level, a truth that most spacefaring civilizations had never needed to learn. Safety was not given, it was built. The fleet that emerged from jump at the edge of Ketharan space was not the fleet the Ketharan had modeled for. Their sensor arrays registered the contact signatures, and the computers began auto-classifying hull configurations, drive signatures, energy outputs, and then stopped, confused, and began again. The tonnage readings were wrong. They had to be wrong. No Tier 3 civilization built ships that size. The mass displacement figures the sensors were returning belonged to warships that, according to the Conclave's own classification index, humanity should not have possessed for another 80 years minimum. On the Ketharan military command station at the border, a young sensor officer named Hecht stared at her display for 11 seconds before she picked up the command channel. "High Command," she said, "I need you to look at my screen." There was a pause, then her commanding officer's voice dismissive. "What is it?" "The human fleet," Hecht said. She had been trained to report facts without emotion. She tried very hard to honor that training. "It's not what we were told it would be." There was a longer pause. "How different?" Hecht looked at the numbers again. Then she looked at the deployment spread, the geometric precision of it. Thousands of vessels arranged not randomly, but in interlocking fields of fire so mathematically perfect they looked less like a fleet and more like a single weapon with 10,000 moving parts. "Significantly," she said quietly. On Earth, in the quiet room where the Secretary General sat alone watching fleet telemetry on a private feed, the only sound for a very long time was the soft hum of the air recyclers. She had carried this secret for 6 years. Every Secretary General before her had carried it. The fleet that the Conclave knew about was real. It was just not complete. The rest had been built slowly, quietly, over 70 years of patient construction in facilities tucked behind asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres and the spectacular mundanity of deep space, where no one was looking because there was nothing interesting to look at. Humanity had never hidden it out of aggression. They had hidden it because, long before they reached the stars, they had learned a lesson written in rivers of blood across their own history. The moment you show everyone the full measure of what you are capable of, the moment you lose the one thing more valuable than any weapon: the element of surprise. The Ketharan High Council had 47 minutes between the first sensor contact report and the engagement. They spent 32 of those minutes in denial, 12 in frantic redeployment, and 3 in something that had no official military classification, but which, in informal human terms, would later be described simply as panic. The battle math, it turned out, was not even close. The first engagement of what history would call the Voss campaign lasted 11 minutes and 23 seconds. This was not a rounding error. The battle logs, authenticated, time-stamped, and later submitted as evidence at the conclave tribunal, showed 11 minutes and 23 seconds from the moment Admiral Mbenga's fleet cleared its engagement threshold to the moment the last operational Catharan forward defense vessel either surrendered, retreated, or ceased to exist as a functioning warship. 212 Catharan ships against the first wave of humanity's advance fleet. Human losses, 2 frigates. Both were from the same squadron and both went down not to Catharan fire, but to a navigational miscalculation in the debris field created by the first 60 seconds of combat. The wreckage of destroyed Catharan vessels accumulated faster than the tactical AI had modeled, because the modeling had assumed a longer engagement. No one had modeled an engagement this short. The surviving crew of the frigate ENS Meridian were recovered within 20 minutes by search and rescue corvettes that had been prepositioned specifically for that purpose, because Mbenga had planned for human losses with the same exhaustive care that he had planned for everything else. The recovery rate was 91%. The 9%, 11 sailors, were buried 2 weeks later on Earth, in a ceremony that the Secretary General attended personally, at which no speeches were given because the families had asked for quiet. In the Galactic Conclave's Military Intelligence Wing, an analyst named Veroth, a luminari, one of the galaxy's most mathematically gifted species, received the battle telemetry feed from a neutral observation buoy that had been quietly positioned in the region 18 months prior, during a routine scientific expedition that was, in fact, not entirely routine. Veroth processed the data for 4 minutes. Then he filed an emergency escalation request, flagged maximum priority, and walked personally to the office of the Conclave's Supreme Military Assessor, a position that had been largely ceremonial for 300 years because the Conclave had not faced a credible military crisis in that time. He laid the data tablet on the desk. The Supreme Military Assessor, a Vreth general named Akath who wore his age in the silver patterning of his scales, looked at the numbers for a long moment. "Is this verified?" Akath asked. "3 times, Veroth said, by me and 2 independent systems. The engagement duration is accurate." Akath looked up. "We classified humanity as Tier 3. "Yes." "What tier does this engagement profile suggest?" Veroth was quiet for a moment. "Our classification system," he said carefully, "does not have a category for what this engagement profile suggests. The closest existing designation would be Tier 1, which currently contains only us, the Hall, and the Vothkai. But even Tier 1 engagement metrics don't." He paused. The Catharan forward fleet was not weak. By any conventional measure, it was a credible defensive force. It lasted 11 minutes. Akath was silent. "The more pressing issue," Veroth continued, "is the tonnage data. These ships," he pointed to the fleet signatures still hovering on the display, "these vessels do not appear in any public registry, any conclave inspection record, or any intelligence file I have access to. They were built in secret, over decades. They hid their military capacity. They hid approximately." Veroth pulled up a figure he had triple-checked because he had not believed it the first time. 73% of their actual military capacity, from the Conclave's observation, for an estimated period of 60 to 80 years. Akath sat back in his chair. "Why?" Veroth folded his hands. "I've been reading human history since I received this data. I believe I have a theory." He set another tablet on the desk. In their pre-contact period, they had a documented strategic tradition of maintaining reserve capabilities that adversaries were not aware of. The reasoning, as best I can translate the cultural logic, appears to be something like. He checked his translation notes. "If they know exactly what you have, they can calculate exactly what you are willing to use. If they don't know, they can't calculate anything at all." The Supreme Military Assessor stared at the ceiling of his office for a long moment. Outside the Conclave's great transparasteel observation dome, Stars burned with complete indifference. "How many more systems can they reach?" he asked finally. "All of them," Veroth said. "Every inhabited system in the Ketharan Empire within a projected timeline of," he hesitated, "16 to 22 days if they maintain current fleet velocity. And beyond Ketharan space." Veroth did not answer immediately. He didn't need to. The answer was on the display, in the quietly terrifying geometry of a fleet that was larger, faster, and more precisely organized than anything the galaxy had been told to expect. In his fortified bunker on Kethara Prime, High Executor Vroth, who had laughed at the Secretary General's 90-second statement, was no longer laughing. He was convening an emergency session of the High Council in the kind of frantic urgency that, 3 days earlier, he would have found undignified. His military chief stood before the holographic display showing the remnants of the forward fleet and said, in a voice stripped of all ceremony, "They didn't lose a single ship to our weapons." "2 frigates, Vroth said. "They lost 2 frigates." "To their own debris field," the chief replied. "Not to us, we never hit them." He looked at the display. "High Executor, we never hit them." The room was very quiet. Vroth thought about the broadcast he had ordered. The deliberate, public execution of a human diplomat, broadcast on 17 conclave frequencies, designed to send a message that the newcomers were beneath the law and beneath response. He had sent a message, all right. He was beginning to understand that he had simply misread humanity's reply. The emergency conclave delegation that intercepted Admiral Mbenga's fleet at the edge of the Ketharan's second defensive perimeter was the most distinguished assembly of alien leadership ever gathered in a single location. The Luminary High Speaker, Prelate Jan, 600 years old, revered across the galaxy as the moral voice of the conclave, led it personally. With him came the Hall Resonance Council's senior emissary, the Vreth Federation's deputy chancellor, and representatives from 9 other civilizations whose collective diplomatic weight was, on any normal occasion, sufficient to stop wars, reorder borders, and settle disputes that had festered for generations. They emerged from jump in a vessel marked with the conclave's peace sigil, a configuration of lights recognized under interstellar law as inviolable, the same law that was supposed to have protected Ilara Vas. Mbenga halted the fleet's advance. He received the delegation aboard the ENS Ilara Vas in the ship's formal conference suite. He had the long table set with water, with fruit from Earth's agricultural colonies, and with tea, real tea, grown in the Sri Lankan highlands, transported in vacuum-sealed canisters that his logistics officer had quietly ensured were aboard before departure, because Mbenga had suspected this moment would come and had wanted to be ready for it. He stood when the delegation entered. He greeted each member by name in their own language. He had spent the transit time studying each of them. Prelate Jan, accustomed to setting the tone in any room he entered, found himself briefly recalibrating. They sat. Mbenga poured tea himself, without ceremony, and then folded his hands on the table and gave the prelate his complete, unhurried attention. Jan spoke for 22 minutes. His argument was elegant, historically grounded, and genuinely compassionate. He acknowledged the horror of what had happened to Ambassador Voss. He condemned the Ketharan's actions explicitly and without qualification, a significant concession that Mbenga noted and appreciated. He spoke about the sacred accord, about the 3,000 years of peace it had underwritten, about the civilizations that had been saved from war by the existence of a space where words could be exchanged in safety. He argued that destroying the Ketharan Empire would not restore the law. It would simply replace one act of violence with another, at catastrophic scale. It was the best argument against what Mbenga was doing that could possibly have been made. The Admiral recognized this, because he had made the same argument himself, privately in his cabin, at 200 hours on the 3rd night of transit. He had not slept much since then, but he had arrived at the same answer every time. When Jan finished, Mbenga was quiet for a moment, then he spoke. He agreed with almost everything the prelate had said. He said it clearly, without irony. He genuinely agreed. The accord mattered. Peace mattered. The framework of interstellar civilization was worth protecting. Which is exactly why, he said, we're here. He explained what humanity had done with the fleet. Every target selected in the campaign so far, 21 strikes in 4 days, had been a military installation, a command facility, a weapons depot, or a shipyard. He slid a data pad across the table. Every target listed, cross-referenced against Ketharan civilian registry maps that humanity's intelligence division had been quietly compiling for 9 years. Not one hospital, not one agricultural center, not one civilian population node. We are not destroying the Ketharan people, Mbenga said. We are destroying the Ketharan military's capacity to threaten a diplomat ever again. Those are different things. We know the difference. Jan studied the target list. The hall emissary produced a harmonic of deep uncertainty. The Vreth deputy chancellor leaned back and said nothing. You could stop, Jan said. You have proven your point. The galaxy has seen what humanity is capable of. That alone. With respect, prelate, Mbenga said, and there was something in his voice that was not unkind but was absolutely immovable. If we stop now, we have proven that human diplomats can be murdered for political theater, and that the cost is a demonstration. That is not a cost that will deter anyone who wants to make a statement at our expense. He gave the delegation 48 hours to evacuate non-Ketharan civilians from the next 3 target systems. He provided the evacuation corridors humanity had pre-planned, specific routes, specific timings, coordinated to avoid any engagement with human fleet movements. They had already mapped the evacuation routes, before the delegation arrived, before the delegation had even been assembled. Prelate Jan looked at the evacuation plans and was quiet for a long time. You planned for this conversation, he said. We planned for everything, Mbenga replied simply. The delegation left. They used the evacuation corridors. Every non-Ketharan civilian in those 3 systems was clear within 31 hours. The fleet advanced on hour 48, exactly as stated. In the conclave chamber, as the reports came in, something shifted in the room's atmosphere, a subtle recalibration that touched every delegation present. They had come to this crisis expecting to manage an angry, grieving civilization. What they were encountering was something more unsettling, a civilization that was not angry at all, that had planned and built and waited, and was now executing with a precision that suggested grief had been felt privately, in full, and then set aside in favor of purpose. Several delegations quietly updated their intelligence files on humanity. The new classification was left blank for 3 days while analysts argued about what word to use. On the 9th day of the campaign, with 7 of their 14 systems' military infrastructure destroyed, and the fleet's advance showing no signs of hesitation, the Ketharan High Council made its most desperate move. High Executor Vroth personally authorized a galaxy-wide broadcast, distributed across every conclave frequency, every civilian relay, every news aggregation network that the Ketharan diplomatic corps could access. It ran for 6 hours on continuous loop before the conclave could even convene to discuss a response. The broadcast was a masterwork of fabrication. Doctored sensor footage showing human fleet vessels firing on civilian population centers. Falsified casualty numbers, 300,000 Ketharan civilians dead, according to the figures. Testimonies from actors in civilian dress, recorded in studios on Kethara Prime and aged digitally to look like refugee camp footage. A voiceover informal conclave standard, calm and measured, describing a genocide in progress. It was sophisticated. The Ketharan had prepared it over years, a contingency plan for exactly this kind of scenario, polished and ready to deploy. And for approximately 6 hours it worked. 3 conclave civilizations, the Parath Sovereignty, the Devori Collective, and the Neshan Theocracy, mobilized defensive fleets in response. The conclave chamber erupted in condemnation. 17 delegations filed emergency protest motions. The human ambassador in the grand chamber sat very still and said nothing while the room burned around her. She had been waiting for this. Humanity's Intelligence Division, formerly called the Diplomatic Security Analytical Bureau, known informally among its own staff as the people who read everything and say nothing, had been monitoring state media infrastructure for 9 years. They had noticed the contingency broadcast files 18 months ago. They had quietly, patiently, positioned observation buoys throughout the Ketharan Empire specifically to create an authenticated record of every human strike. Every target, every approach vector, every weapon's discharge, time-stamped, cryptographically sealed, and simultaneously backed up to 3 independent servers in neutral space. They released the counter-broadcast 5 hours and 51 minutes after the Ketharan feed began. What it contained was everything. Real-time footage from every strike, from multiple angles, with targeting data overlaid. The coordinates of every hit cross-referenced against the Ketharan's own publicly filed civilian registry maps, the same maps the Ketharan government had submitted to the Conclave Census Bureau 8 years earlier. Authenticated sensor logs from 3 neutral observation posts that had been positioned in the region for routine astronomical survey purposes and had, entirely incidentally, been recording fleet movements continuously for the past 11 days. And then, because the Bureau was thorough to a degree that bordered on art, one more thing. A side-by-side timestamp comparison showing that several locations depicted in the Ketharan atrocity footage had been visited by human fleet vessels, after which those locations had been detected as fully intact by the neutral observation buoys, with no damaged signatures whatsoever. The 3 mobilized fleets stood down. The conclave chamber went from eruption to a silence so complete it was almost physical. But the counter-broadcast had a second effect that no one in the Ketharan High Council had anticipated. It prompted others to speak. The Tessari Republic, a small, quiet civilization that had spent centuries carefully maintaining neutrality in all conclave affairs, made an unprecedented move. Through a back channel to the human ambassador, they transmitted a sealed file. Inside was documentation of a Ketharan diplomatic incident from 60 years earlier, in which a Tessari trade negotiator had been detained and never returned. The official story had been an accident. The Tessari had known it wasn't. But they had been too small and too isolated to answer, and they had filed it away and survived by pretending, very convincingly, that it had not happened. They were done pretending. The file was followed over the next 18 hours by similar transmissions from 4 other civilizations. Quiet, small, careful peoples who had been on the wrong end of Ketharan contempt at some point in the past century and had absorbed it and moved on because there was no other option. Now there was an option. It was walking through the Ketharan Empire in 17-system boots, and it was not blinking. Humanity's ambassador received each file, acknowledged it formally, and forwarded it to the Conclave's judicial registry without comment. In the Conclave chamber, a conversation was beginning that had nothing to do with stopping Admiral Mbenga. It was about what came next, about what a post-Ketharan High Council galaxy needed to look like, about the gaps in the sacred accord that had allowed this to happen, about who was going to write the new rules. The human ambassador, who had been sitting quietly at her table for 9 days while the galaxy talked around her, requested the floor for the first time. She spoke for 4 minutes. She said that humanity had no interest in domination, no territorial ambitions beyond their existing colonies, and no desire to be a permanent military presence in anyone else's neighborhood. She said that what humanity wanted was simple, a conclave where the law meant what it said, for every species, at every size. She said that the fleet would stop the moment the Ketharan military capacity was neutralized, and the High Council was remanded to conclave custody. She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the luminary prelate began to applaud, a deeply unusual act for a species that communicated approval through bioluminescent signaling. He used his hands, deliberately, in the human fashion. One by one, others joined. On the 14th day, the ENS Ilara Vos entered orbit above Cathara Prime. It did not fire. Admiral Mbenga had been precise about the entire campaign's architecture from the beginning. Military infrastructure was the target, not people. Shipyards, command stations, weapons platforms, defense grids, all of it, across 7 of the 14 Ketharan systems, was gone. The Ketharan military did not have a functioning chain of command. It did not have a fleet. In the final accounting, it had approximately 12 operational combat vessels scattered across 3 systems, none of them able to communicate with each other, because the relay network had been one of the first things taken offline. What Cathara Prime had was its cities, its population, its 3,000 years of art and science and culture, and a high council that had spent 12 days attempting every option available to them and finding each one closed. The propaganda gambit had collapsed. 3 requests for conclave mediation had been formally declined on the grounds that the conclave's judicial process was now active and superseded emergency diplomatic intervention. A back-channel offer to return to negotiations, filtered through a third-party intermediary, had been received by Mbenga's staff, acknowledged politely, and filed without response. On day 12, the High Council had attempted to flee. This was not a decision that was announced or debated. It was simply what happened when 7 people who had spent their careers at the apex of power finally understood, concretely and not abstractly, that the apex was gone. They had boarded a private vessel registered under a shell corporation, using transit documents in false names, and departed Cathara Prime via a route that avoided all primary tracking corridors. It was a good plan, for a civilization that had not spent 9 years watching them. The destroyer ENS Consequence was waiting for them at the 3rd relay point. It had been there for 6 hours before the High Council's vessel arrived. The intercept was so quiet and so complete that the Council's pilot later testified he had genuinely not seen the Consequence until its running lights were 30 meters from his viewport. High Executor Vroth was taken into custody personally by the Consequence's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Ashanti Osai, a 34-year-old woman from Accra whose grandmother had watched the original broadcast on a Tuesday morning and had not left her apartment for 2 days afterward. Osai reported later that Vroth had said nothing during the arrest. He had simply looked at her, a human, a newcomer, standing in his doorway with the quiet authority of someone who had never doubted the outcome. And for the first time in his life, High Executor Vroth appeared to understand something that he had failed to understand when it might have mattered. The council members were transported to Conclave Neutral Station Kappa 7, the galaxy's only purpose-built interstellar legal facility, which had been constructed 800 years ago and used for genuine proceedings exactly 6 times. Its legal staff of 42 had been supplemented, over the past 10 days, by 300 additional personnel. Humanity's legal team had submitted 2,000 pages of evidence documentation 3 days before the council even arrived. They had been preparing the case while the fleet was still in transit. Mbenga received confirmation of the council's capture aboard the ENS Ilara Vos, standing at the viewport through which Cathara Prime was visible as a pale green disk against the black. His communications officer reported the news. He nodded once. He ordered the fleet to begin its withdrawal to holding positions outside the system. He stood there for a long time after, looking at the planet. His aide, a young ensign who had never served in combat before this campaign, eventually approached and stood beside him in silence. "Sir," the ensign said finally, because he felt he had to say something, "we won." Mbenga was quiet for a moment. "Ambassador Vos walked into a room unarmed," he said, "because the law said she would be safe." He paused. "We won when the law means that again. We'll find out if we did." He turned from the viewport. "Begin the withdrawal, And someone get me a channel to the reconstruction coordination team. We've got work to do. In the conclave chamber, the galaxy watched the human fleet pull back from Cathara Prime without firing a single shot at its surface, and the conversation that had been building for 14 days reached its necessary conclusion. The trial would happen. The evidence existed. The witnesses existed. And 22 civilizations had already confirmed their judicial participation before the High Council's shuttle even docked at Kappa 7. The trial lasted 31 days. Humanity's legal team presented their case in the same manner that Admiral Mbenga had conducted the campaign, methodically, without theatrics, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having more evidence than you need and knowing exactly where every piece of it lives. The authenticated broadcast, the targeting logs showing systematic civilian avoidance, the 5 sealed testimonies from other civilizations, the Tessari and 4 others detailing prior Ketharan violations, the studio footage from Cathara Prime that had been used in the fabricated atrocity broadcast, now traced forensically to its origin, and the original recording, the one the galaxy had already seen, now entered formally into the Conclave's permanent legal record with every metadata tag intact, every timestamp authenticated, leaving no space whatsoever for alternative interpretation. High Executor Vroth spoke in his own defense for 3 hours on the 22nd day. His argument was philosophical, that humanity's response had been disproportionate, that the sacred accord contained no provision authorizing what had been done to the Ketharan military. He was not wrong about the second point. The accord, as written, had no enforcement mechanism. It never had. 3,000 years of peace had rested on the assumption that no member civilization would test that absence. The presiding judges, 1 Luminari, 1 Hall, 1 Vreth, 1 Tessari, and 1 human, the composition itself a statement, deliberated for 4 days. The verdict was unanimous. Life imprisonment to be served in conclave custody for all 7 members of the High Council. The mechanism of Ambassador Voss's death was read into the record in full, for the galaxy to hear, in the language of law rather than broadcast shock, and it was somehow worse in that register, more real, more irreducible, more permanent. In a primary school in Nairobi, a teacher who had pulled 26 children away from a screen on a Tuesday morning watched the verdict broadcast from her couch at home, alone, and sat with it for a long time. The Ketharan Empire was not dismantled. This was the decision that surprised the galaxy most. Humanity's position, stated clearly by their ambassador in the conclave chamber on the day the fleet withdrew, was that the Ketharan people were not the High Council. That 3,000 years of civilization, of art and language and accumulated knowledge, were not accountable for the choices of 7 men who had believed themselves untouchable. A reconstruction mandate was established under conclave supervision. The new Ketharan government, reformist, shaken, desperately eager to begin the work of becoming something different, was recognized by humanity before any other civilization made its formal acknowledgement. This was deliberate. It was the first signal humanity sent after the shooting stopped, and the galaxy read it correctly. We did not come to replace your contempt with ours. The shipyards were rebuilt with conclave-monitored capacity limits. The military was restructured under an inspection regime. Economic integration programs were proposed, developed, and tentatively, awkwardly, with the particular awkwardness of parties who have hurt each other badly and are trying to find a reason to try, begun. Ilara Voss's state funeral was held on Earth 6 weeks after the verdict. Delegates from 31 species attended. More alien dignitaries gathered on a single human world than at any point in history. Many of them had not known her name before the broadcast. All of them knew it now. The ceremony was quiet. No military display, no speeches, no triumphalism. Her family had asked for music, specifically a recording of a song she had apparently loved, something old from before the space age, with piano and a human voice doing something that several alien delegates later described in their private journals as the most beautiful and incomprehensible sound they had ever encountered. 3 of them wept, despite having no cultural framework for why the music produced that response. They wept anyway, because some things translate without language. Admiral Mbenga stood at the back of the crowd in a plain civilian coat, without rank insignia, without the decorations that had been offered him and that he had politely declined. He had been asked to speak. He had declined that too. He stood and he listened to the music, and he looked at the image of Ilara Voss projected above the gathered crowd. Her face caught in a photograph taken 3 weeks before her death, mid-laugh at something someone off-camera had said, wholly unaware of being photographed, wholly alive. He stood there until the last note ended and the crowd began to move, and then he walked alone to the edge of the ceremony ground where the city opened up to sky, and he stood looking up at nothing in particular. The Voss clause was formally added to the sacred accord 5 days later. It was 2 sentences long, written jointly by humanity's legal team and the Conclave's treaty office after 3 weeks of deliberation. It stated that any member civilization's violation of diplomatic immunity constituted an act of aggression against all signatories, and that the injured civilization's right to respond was bounded only by proportionality to the threat, with the explicit acknowledgement that permanent deterrence was a legitimate measure of proportionality. That last phrase was humanity's contribution to the language. The Conclave's treaty lawyers had debated it for 6 days before accepting it. Every member civilization signed. 29 signed in the first hour. The remainder followed within a week. Some signed because they believed in it. Some signed because they had watched the past month unfold from beginning to end and understood, with absolute clarity, what the cost of not signing might someday look like. Several signed both for both reasons, which was perhaps the most honest position of all. Peter Sewell, retired, watching from his quiet station 11 light-years from human space, received a copy of the signed accord via diplomatic courier and read the Voss clause twice. Then he finished the paper he had been writing on the nature of human patience and why it should terrify you, and submitted it to the Conclave's academic press. It became the most widely read political science paper in galactic history within 3 months of publication. Its final line, translated across 47 languages and eventually painted on a wall inside Conclave Neutral Station Kappa 7, where the High Council still served their sentences, read, "Humanity does not fight because it is cruel. It fights because it made a promise to every diplomat, every peacemaker, every soul who ever walked unarmed into a hostile room with nothing but words and the belief that words should be enough. When you kill one of them, you do not make humanity afraid. You remind them why they built everything else." The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do, into new disputes and new discoveries, new friendships and new tensions, new mornings on 1,000 worlds where people woke up and made breakfast and worried about ordinary things. But the Voss clause held. And for the first time in history, it held because everyone in the galaxy understood, not theoretically, not academically, but in the lived and immediate memory of 31 days of trial and 14 days of campaign, and one Tuesday morning in March, when a broadcast interrupted a weather report, exactly what holding it meant. No one tested it again. Not once, not for a very long time. And somewhere in the archives of a primary school in Nairobi, in a folder of lesson plans a teacher had quietly updated after that Tuesday, there was a new entry in the unit on interstellar law. It was 1 sentence, written in the teacher's own hand, added between 2 printed paragraphs about the sacred accord. The law is only as real as the people willing to defend it. She had 26 students. She made sure all of them understood it. And